All right, welcome back, Biology 102. Today we are talking about ecology. Ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. This can include both the interactions between biotic factors or living factors in a particular space, or between biotic and abiotic factors, so both living and non-living factors within a particular space. You may think that you're not interacting with your environment as you sit here and watch this video, or this koala sleeps in a tree, but in fact you are. You're giving off gases, your temperature is changing, you're doing various things that release either temperature or gases or things to the environment. And so those kinds of interactions are all a part of what ecology is going to look at. So even if you're minimalistically interacting, you are still interacting. Now, if we go to ecology and look at ecology, there are actually three layers of ecology. There is something called population ecology, community ecology, and ecosystem ecology. Today we're going to focus on that top layer, and subsequent lectures will go to community ecology and ecosystem ecology and kind of break down. But just kind of looking at an overview, population ecology is the interactions of one species. Community ecology is the interactions of two or more species or all the living things in a particular space. And ecosystem ecology throws on non-living factors. So it is the interactions between living things and abiotic or non-living factors that influence them. So with each of these levels, we get sort of more and more complicated. Today, we're going to start with population ecology. A population is a group of one species living in the same area. So like a herd of elk in Idaho, right? Or a herd of deer in Idaho, or a group of wolves that live in Idaho. All of those would be populations that maybe a wildlife ecologist would be interested in looking at. A population ecologist then is going to study the interactions of one single species, like follow a pod of orca and then look at sort of how they're interacting, maybe how they're breeding, who's breeding with who sort of makes a calf each year and like fledges it, things of this nature, right? So in order to understand population ecology and what they study, you need to understand the word species. And a species is a group of organisms that can do three different things. They can interbreed. This group can also produce viable offspring or produce offspring that can also interbreed. So they're not sterile. And then lastly, they do this in nature. So they're not forced to do it in a lab or in a zoo. They can do it on their own in nature. So when we look at population ecology, we're looking at the interactions of those species, those things that can interbreed, produce viable offspring in nature, and the interactions within that particular group. All right, so if we go to sort of population ecology, a population ecologist might be interested in looking at three different things in order to define their population. They might look at population density for a particular group, patterns of dispersion, so how they're spaced across an area, and population growth, how they are adding numbers or subtracting numbers over time. These are some things that a population ecologist might use in order to tell a story about their population. So let's start at the top. What is population density? Population density is the number of individuals of a species in a particular area or volume, if it's like a lake or a stream or something like that. Sometimes these can be exact numbers where we know there's this number of trees or this many wolves, right, in Idaho. Often, though, it is an estimate, right? So scientists will do what we call mark and recapture experiments, where we tag and mark a portion of the population, let them like sort of randomly place themselves, and then go back and like sort of test that population and count them. We can use different formulas in order to get an estimated population size. But even having number of individuals, it tells a story. You can see the state of Idaho over here. You can see green is where there's low amounts of like sort of humans, and then these red splashes and orange splashes are where there is sort of higher numbers of humans. And even given this, right, and plotting just the population density, number of individuals in our state for humans, it tells us a story of how we settled this state. Because if you think about it, what is next to all of these different sort of red places or orange places in our state? If you're thinking right and thinking about your state, you probably have drawn the conclusion that it's water. And so as we settled dry states in the western side of the US, oftentimes humans settled around river systems or lake systems, fresh water of some sort, because that can be something that's really important. Now, adding to population density, sometimes when scientists collect different species, they'll actually note the age. So you can tell sometimes when it's like a newborn or a juvenile, reproductive age, and then maybe an older sort of individual. And then we can plot an age structure. An age structure shows the distribution of individuals in different age groups. And this can reveal how fast or slow our population is growing. It can reveal things like if there's gaps, we can, as scientists, go back and look at like, okay, why wasn't there anything fledged, any birds fledged that particular year? Maybe there's a drought or disease. So we can follow those kinds of gaps to tell a story about our population. We can also do and sort of make survivorship tables from this as well. This tracks the survivorship or the chance of an individual in a given population to survive to various ages. And this gives us usually life expectancy averages, right? So this table is showing humans, but you could do this with wolves and say wolves on average live this many years in the wild or this long in a zoo. And we can talk about things like that. Now, our second thing, so population density helps us describe our population, but also population dispersion helps us describe how a population is spaced within an area. Populations can be clumped, so they can aggregate in groups. This might be like the bison in Yellowstone within huge herds, right, in Lamar Valley, where they clump together for protection against wolves and other predators. Other populations can uniformly space. That's a more even spacing across a given area. This might be due to resources. So sometimes like cacti in the desert are quite uniform because they almost set up a monopoly of resources and they control those in a particular area so that other cacti can't grow there. And so then they get these sort of even spacing patterns. And lastly, random or patternless spacing is also an option. Lots of weeds like dandelions do this. They're very, there's no sort of pressure for them to be in a particular location. They can grow in lots of varieties of ways and spaces. And so it gives kind of a patternless sort of dispersion to how they like sort of grow and populate an area. Now, when we look at these, you might be thinking, well, what's the most common and least common type of dispersion? So if we do most common, if you look at humans ourselves, how we are spaced across the globe, you would notice that we are clumped. And the most common spacing is clumped. This is probably because lots of things need certain resources. So clumping makes that easier to find those things. It's easier to find a mate if you're in a group. And there is protection or safety in numbers. So sometimes that is another reason. The least common is random. It is less common that there aren't resources that drive dispersion or are necessary. So weeds and some things like that can be kind of patternless, but for the most part, lots of things will need different resources and need to be close to them in order to live. So random is our least common. However, I do want to note that your dispersion patterns do change across the lifespan of an organism. And so breeding seasons can bring things together that aren't normally spaced together, and then they space out, or maybe even mating or times of raising young can bring different groups together, and then they space out once the young has sort of fledged or like grown up, right? So these things can change how different populations space themselves over a given area. Our third sort of feature that a population ecologist might be looking at is population growth. And this is the change in the number of individuals of a population over time. So you can see over here in our growth curves, we have our population numbers here, and then our time across the bottom. So this is change in population size, but with time as a factor. An example might be the world human population growth number is about 78 or 74 million additional people per year and some change, right? And so that is our population growth at current. Now, when we look at population growth, there are two models that are often used to describe describe how populations are growing. This is a model because they're almost like opposite ends of the spectrum, but it allows us to say whether a population is closer to this end or this other end of the spectrum. So exponential growth here on our graph, if we look, we have numbers of individuals over time across our bottom. In red over here, exponential growth is the kind of growth that is unregulated or unlimited. So there's no limits on this growth. It's just growing and continuing to double its population across a particular time. Logistic growth is here in blue, and logistic growth is a kind of growth that is slowed eventually by something called the carrying capacity or limiting factors. And so as this population reaches the carrying capacity, then the growth will downturn and kind of slow and sort of flatten out. Carrying capacity is the number of individuals in a population that the environment can support. So it has to do with the number of resources that are required of a population. And you can imagine there's a ceiling on growth where you reach this amount of resources, whether it's water, sunlight, nutrients, food, space, breeding grounds, access, things of that nature. But when you reach those particular resources, then they become limited in supply, and that will make your population slow down its growth and kind of steady out. Now, lots of scientists, these growth types are called models because lots of scientists think they are one and the same, growth pattern. We say often that the beginning part of logistic growth is exponential in nature. And then when you hit that carrying capacity, you kind of see that slowed sort of growth. And so this logistic growth curve actually has both pieces to it. So lots of scientists argue that they're one and the same, but you'll still hear people refer to populations growing exponentially or logistically. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. Now, what kinds of things can slow growth or cause the limit in your population growth so that your numbers kind of slow down at that carrying capacity? Well, there are a couple of different factors. Density dependent limiting factors can limit the size of a population due to its density, and density independent limiting factors can also limit the size of a population. Density dependent limiting factors, the difference is that these become more and more intensified as your population becomes more and more dense. So as your population grows larger, these are kinds of resources that are going to become more and more in demand or more and more limited in supply as your population grows. So these are things like food, access to shelters, resources like water and minerals, sunlight, these kinds of things, as well as diseases, because diseases are going to spread more quickly in denser populations. Density independent limiting factors still limit a population size, but these limit regardless of the size or the density. So these are kind of outside of the size. It doesn't matter if you have 2 or 1,000 individuals, it's going to have the same impacts. These are lots of natural disasters like fires, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and things of this nature that can really scramble up a population. It doesn't really matter in a flood, let's say, if you have 2 deer beside the river or 100, a flood will take out all of those individuals at one time or has that potential. And so we say that it's density independent limiting factors. So these are limits that are limiting regardless of the number of deer beside that particular river. So hopefully this gives you an overview of population ecology. You can fill out your population ecology study sheet, and I will see you next time.